As twilight painted the sky with hues of melancholy, Henry Mason stood in his front yard, the silence shattered only by the whispering leaves. His hands, toughened by the relentless passage of time, shook as he extracted a hefty envelope from his pocket. It bore the seal of finality, the weight of his dread now palpable in his grasp. The contents, an official decree from the Homeowners Association, spearheaded by the relentless Eleanor Pierce, felt like a cold, hard slap to his weathered face. A fine of $50,000, the words leaped from the page, each one a sharp knife slicing through his resolve. His sin, not repainting a fence, not just any fence, but one his father had built over half a century ago, a silent witness to bygone days. The letter didn't stop at mere fines. It threatened foreclosure, an ultimatum that demanded payment within 30 days. Henry's fists tightened, the paper crackling under his fierce grip. He had seen the storm clouds gathering, the petty grievances about his fence, his untamed lawn, the barn that had seen better days. He had dismissed them, but this was no longer a mere annoyance. It was an outright declaration of war. $50,000 was an unimaginable sum for a widower on a fixed income, especially one who had been alone since Margaret, his beloved, left this world 2 years prior. The financial burden was staggering, yet the sheer audacity of Eleanor Pierce and her HOA cohorts seared him even more. They had pecked at him, these vultures, testing his limits, assuming he was nothing more than an old, worn-out man, too weary to fight back. How wrong they were. Henry possessed a power they hadn't even considered, a secret weapon. He owned the only road into Cedar Hollow, that vital artery connecting the community to the world beyond. For decades, as the HOA expanded, they had never once questioned who held the deed to this 1.2-mile lifeline. His father, in his wisdom, had retained it when he sold the land in 1974, a private asset left open for public use. Henry had let them bask in their assumptions, never once revealing the true ownership. The sun dipped low, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber, as shadows stretched like long, delicate fingers across Henry Mason's yard. With a sigh that spoke volumes of his inner turmoil, he crumpled the letter in his hand and cast it into the trash. There would be no yielding, no bowing to their demands. With a determined stride, he made his way to the shed, where his tools awaited their surfaces, catching the last light of day. It was time to reclaim Cedar Hollow from the clutches of those who thought they could control it. Henry had always led a humble existence within the walls of the wooden house his father had built. Born into a lineage of farmers and builders, his early years were spent lugging timber, repairing tractors, and absorbing the essence of engineering from men who prized hard work over formal education. At 25, he married Margaret, and together they raised two daughters who had since flown the nest, leaving Henry to his solitary yet peaceful retirement after a career spent crafting bridges, structures of resilience and permanence. When Margaret passed, silence enveloped their home. The house itself seemed to mourn, with its creaking and groaning, each sound a poignant echo of bygone days. The barn, once alive with the sound of tinkering and laughter, now stood as a solemn tribute to his past. The fence, lovingly hewn by his father, delineated the boundary of a life he held dear. Content with his solitude, Henry had found joy in nurturing his land, coaxing tomatoes from the earth, watching birds dance through the oaks. But then the tranquility was shattered by the HOA. It started with a single letter from Eleanor Pierce, the HOA president, insisting he repaint the fence. "The faded color fails to meet aesthetic standards," Witt declared. Henry chuckled at the audacity, tossing the letter aside. Who was this woman to judge his father's craftsmanship? A retired realtor with a clipboard and a perm dictating the beauty of his world? But the letters didn't stop. They multiplied, each one more demanding than the last. Fines began to pile up: $200 for unmowed grass, $500 for an unapproved mailbox, $1,000 for a branch daring to reach over the sidewalk. These notices were not just about maintaining beauty, they were about control. Eleanor didn't merely desire a picturesque neighborhood. She craved dominion over every blade of grass, every splinter of wood. Henry, steadfast in his resolve, ignored them all. He had never joined the HOA, never signed their pact. Henry Mason stood on his porch, his heart pounding like the war drums of old. The air was thick with tension, the fine of $50,000 and the looming foreclosure threat a stark declaration of war. "They think I'm some pushover," he muttered, his voice a whisper against the wind. "They've got no clue who they're tangling with." Henry wasn't merely a retired engineer mourning the loss of his beloved wife. He was the keeper of a secret weapon, the deed to the access road into Cedar Hollow. Back in the 1970s, his father had sold off most of the family land to developers hungry for suburban sprawl. Yet he retained that 1.2 miles of gravel and asphalt, the neighborhood's lifeline. The deed was unequivocal private property to be used at the owner's discretion. Henry had never boasted about it, allowing the HOA residents to mistakenly believe it was public. He cherished peace, not power plays. Now Eleanor had cornered him, forcing his hand. With a determined spirit, he rummaged through an ancient filing cabinet, unearthing the 1974 agreement, the road deed maps and surveys all yellowed, but as resolute as the day they were signed. He called Thomas Reed, a lawyer, and once his student, now his ally. Over coffee, Henry laid it bare. They've been using this road for 40 years without a single inquiry about its ownership. Thomas leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. They're in for a shock. Let's make them rue this day. As Thomas began drafting the legal filings, Henry braced himself for the battle ahead. He had spent years building bridges, not burning them, yet Eleanor's relentless bullying left him no choice. Her letters had sharpened her tone, grown more imperious. Then one afternoon, a black SUV rolled up to his property, its presence ominous. Two HOA enforcement officers, more muscle than law, stepped out. One, a tattooed brute, smirked. "Mr. Mason, we're here to inspect your property. You've ignored our standards." Henry gripped his rake, his voice steady as bedrock. "You're not welcome here." The man sneered, his words dripping with threat. "You'll wish you'd cooperated," he said before retreating. But the HOA did not relent. Workers arrived unannounced, tearing down a... Henry's heart ached as he stared at the dilapidated section of his father's fence, now a symbol of encroaching tyranny. Splinters like tiny soldiers had invaded his once peaceful yard. Seething with frustration, Henry captured the destruction on camera and dialed Thomas, his voice shaking with the weight of betrayal. And then in the dead of night, his beloved Bella, the golden retriever who had been his steadfast companion since Margaret's passing, disappeared into the shadows. He searched, his voice hoarse from calling her name, until the first light of dawn kissed the horizon. The phone rang. It was Sam, the neighbor, with news that twisted Henry's stomach into knots. Bella had been found locked in a van among other stolen pets. Retrieving her, his heart pounded with relief and rage. Though there was no evidence, Henry knew deep in his bones that Eleanor was behind this cruel act. This was personal. The final insult came when an HOA-branded utility truck rolled up to his home, their intent clear as day, to sever his connection to the very essentials of life. "Until you comply," the crew chief announced, his voice devoid of warmth. Henry, with the fury of a man pushed too far, stormed to his shed wrench in hand. With decades-old skill, he shut off his own utilities, first securing the lines with a defiant twist. "Try me," he challenged, his voice echoing through the stillness. They left, but the air was thick with unspoken threats. Eleanor would stop at nothing. Cedar Hollow was a community divided. Some neighbors, tired of the HOA's overreach, rallied behind Henry. Others, perhaps seduced by Eleanor's vision of an immaculate utopia, supported her. She called an emergency meeting, tightening her grip like a vice. But Henry, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. He spent days organizing documents, rehearsing with Thomas, preparing to unveil the truth. The community center buzzed with anticipation as residents streamed in for the HOA meeting. Eleanor Pierce stood at the front, her posture commanding, her silk blouse as immaculate as her intentions. Henry, however, had slipped in early, taking a back seat, his stack of papers concealed in a worn satchel. Eleanor began with a confidence that belied the storm brewing in the room. "Thank you for attending," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Mr. Mason has defied our rules and refused his fines. We're here to discuss legal action." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrents of injustice. Henry rose, his movements slow and deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. Eleanor's smile flickered, a brief flash of doubt. "Henry," she snapped, her patience thinning, "you've had every chance to comply. Pay the fine or we'll proceed." He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've got..." Henry, his voice trembling with frustration, slammed his papers onto the table, asserting his dominance. "I own the road into Cedar Hollow," he declared, his words slicing through the tension like a knife. Silence fell thick and heavy, as if the very air had turned to steel. Eleanor's jaw clenched, her face a mask of disbelief and defiance. What? She gasped, her voice a whisper of incredulity. Henry, with a deliberate calm, unfurled the deeds maps and agreements before her. My father retained this road when he sold the land. It's private property, mine. You've been using it for decades under a false assumption. It's not yours. His voice was firm, his eyes piercing. Whispers broke out like wildfire. This is nonsense. Eleanor sputtered her words, tripping over each other in haste. Henry, undeterred, presented the 1974 deed. No mistake here. I'm done with your threats. You have no power over me or this road. He stabbed a finger at the map. Without my consent, you're all cut off. No fines, no control. Eleanor visibly shaken her face. Ashen watched as her world seemed to crumble. I've filed an injunction, Henry added, his voice steady. Your fine's void. Sue me. You'll lose. From the crowd, Clara Evans stood up, her voice strong, despite her years. I've lived here for 30 years. Henry's right. I stand with him. Others followed Sam, Lydia, and more, their applause growing like a storm swell. Eleanor's protests were feeble now, her voice cracking under the weight of dissent. This is outrageous, she managed, but the tide had turned. The meeting erupted into chaos, neighbors recounting tales of her oppressive reign. The next morning, Henry planted a sign at the road's entrance. Private property. Road use suspended. Contact H. Mason. Cars backed up, school buses stalled, delivery vans honked in frustration. Eleanor's call was desperate, her voice thin. We need to talk through, my lawyer. Henry responded, his tone unyielding. At the courthouse mediation, Henry's demands were clear. Cancel the fine, Eleanor's public apology and resignation, dissolve the HOA, form a resident council, and a symbolic $1 yearly road lease. The working group Eleanor had once commanded resisted, but the outraged residents forced her hand. In a packed meeting, Eleanor, her voice brittle as autumn leaves, spoke. I apologize to Mr. Mason and Cedar Hollow for the distress I've caused. I resign. Silence met her words, a heavy, palpable quiet. Henry nodded a simple gesture and left. Peace was restored. A new council rose, promising cooperation over fines. Henry reopened the road for a symbolic $1 a year, the lease framed beside his father's old deeds. In his father's treasured toolbox, Henry found the strength to rebuild his cedar fence, a symbol of heritage and resilience. Clara, with her heart in her hands, offered a cobbler, exclaiming, You showed them. Henry, with a quiet chuckle, replied, Quiet strength wins. In that shed, the children absorbed the art of woodworking, a tradition passed down. Eleanor, relinquishing her hold, sold her home and departed. Her time had ended. Now Cedar Hollow flourished, liberated, serene, its future bright with Henry's enduring legacy. Thank you, dear viewers, for joining us on this emotional journey. Your support means the world. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give us a like, share this story, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel for more touching tales. Together, let's keep the spirit of Cedar Hollow alive.